Exercise Vacuum was conceived by Canadian Forces Headquarters as a battalion-scale tactical training exercise on which chemical situations would be imposed. It was designed to evaluate protective drills, procedures, and equipment currently available for the defense of the Canadian Forces. The exercise was carried out at the Defense Research Establishment, Suffield, in the fall of 1968. Suffield is located in southeast Alberta, and the very large range area and the airport were essential to the success of the project. The airport facilities were manned for this exercise by air personnel from the armed forces. An exercise of this magnitude required a year's planning and 6 months of intensive preparation by various Defense Research Board and Canadian Forces agencies. This film is a record of the exercise, including the interim chemical training and maneuver system developed for and employed in the exercise. Most of the equipment and supplies were airlifted into Suffield in Hercules aircraft from Transport Command and Buffalo aircraft from Mobile Command. At peak activity, planes were coming in at 2-minute intervals. A total of 182 flights were made to provide the equipment and stores to support the 1,500-man field force and 500 scientific and military backup personnel. Transport Command and Mobile Command provided the necessary maintenance and personnel to service all aircraft used in the exercise. Troops were well supplied with fresh rations, which were transported from the airport and stored at Camp Vacuum, the administrative center for the exercise. Brigadier General W.C. Leonard, CD, Commander 1st Canadian Combat Group, was appointed exercise director, and he set up his combat group headquarters adjacent to Camp Vacuum. To support the exercise, the commander had 1st Queen's Own Rifles of Canada from Victoria, BC, Company B, 2nd Battalion, 61st Infantry, 5th U.S. Mechanized Division, 1 company of the Black Watch from Britain, 1 reconnaissance squadron from the Fort Garry Horse Armored of Calgary, 1 artillery battery from 3 Royal Canadian Horse Artillery Shiloh, and the normal supporting troops required in a tactical training exercise. Mobile Command, supported by other commands, supplied the training, umpire, and control staff. The U.S. Mechanized Company were seasoned veterans and arrived completely equipped. The troops were airlifted, and their equipment was shipped by special train. This contingent came from Fort Carson, Colorado. The Black Watch Company, fresh from a tour of duty in Europe, were airlifted to Canada from the United Kingdom. To simplify transport arrangements, Canadian vehicles were provided for their use during this exercise. The interim training and maneuver system used in Exercise Vacuum had been developed to test defenses against chemicals, and a number of training agents with a wide range of properties had been developed to provide the chemical situations required in the exercise. These had motivating properties. That is, they cannot cause permanent harm to the troops, but are sufficient to ensure the correct defensive reaction. 60,000 pounds of liquid training agents were prepared at Suffield, in addition to others in powder and vapor form. The liquids could be used in a spray of fine droplets or in heavy concentrations as a ground contaminant. Safety was not left to chance. The drums containing the training agents were color-coded, and samples were taken from every batch mixed. All samples were analyzed by Suffield technical staff to confirm their correct composition. The training agents were later charged into a number of different dispersal devices. One weapon system for dispersing the liquids, which provided effective large area coverage, used the E-26 spray tank. Each tank was charged with 750 pounds of training agent. The tanks were carried on T-33 aircraft flown by 408 Squadron. Accurate meteorological information is essential to the successful deployment of chemical attacks. The performance of the T-33 E-26 spray tank weapon system had been thoroughly evaluated to determine the effective coverage under a range of wind speed conditions. Two scientists from the Defense Research Board volunteered to report the results of this spray attack. A training agent in powder form was developed to simulate additional types of chemical attack. One of the devices used with this powder was the US M4 or M5 riot control agent disperser. This is a pressurized dispenser which will function when mounted on either helicopters or ground vehicles. Because of the difficulties of handling bulk powder, complete protection was provided for all personnel involved in filling and operating these dispersal devices. After filling, standard decontamination procedures were always used to clean the outside surface of the dispenser. Further safety precautions were taken inside the helicopter to ensure that no hazard existed for pilot or crew. A modification was made to the emission system of the M5 to allow the equipment to be used on the CH-113 helicopter. Prior to the exercise, the performance of these dispensers had been tested to provide experience and confidence in their use, and they proved to be extremely effective dispersal devices. At normal heights of emission and wind speed, they could produce motivating concentrations over a distance 1,000 meters across wind and 3,000 meters downwind. A simulated landmine was developed, which was safe to use close to personnel. This was extensively tested to prove its safety and its efficiency in dispersing either powder or liquid training agents. Some of the fillings were dyed to help assess the range and density of contamination produced. Volunteers again undertook to assess the effectiveness of the agents. The eye effects produced by the fillings, demonstrated by the response of this unprotected volunteer, can be avoided by the correct use of protective equipment. Another dispersal device was required to provide vapor or liquid contamination, simulating attack by airburst artillery or rockets. The device, designed and produced for this exercise, was based on the principle of the spigot mortar. The 155mm airburst chemical simulator was simply a plastic bottle containing approximately 1 gallon of liquid or powder. The bottles could be fired into the air from a mortar to explode at any desired height up to 500 feet. This device was also tested extensively prior to use in exercise vacuum. DRB scientists, along with Canadian Armed Forces personnel, checked the dispersal pattern of contamination. The troops used to carry out the ground-based chemical attacks in exercise vacuum were supplied from 3 Field Squadron, Royal Canadian Engineers, Chilliwack. As a prerequisite to using these chemical devices, the troops were thoroughly trained in their duties by experienced technical staff from the Defense Research Board and an Armed Forces officer seconded to Suffield. As part of their training, Pre-exercise tests were carried out with the U.S. portable E8 16-tube launcher and cartridge. This is capable of firing 64 small projectiles filled with training agent in 4 ripples. Again, volunteers participated in the trials. Heavy ground contamination was required in the exercise to provide chemical barriers. To this end, a commercially available agricultural boom sprayer was modified, and it carried out the chemical contamination very thoroughly and rapidly. Further modifications were made to the sprayer so it could be carried and operated from the CH-113 helicopter, and so provide ground contamination in difficult terrain that could not be navigated by surface vehicles. A small agricultural sprayer was also tested, the Mighty Mite, of U.S. origin. To complete the range of disseminators needed for additional tactical situations, the exhaust systems of several Jeeps were modified to disperse training agents as clouds of vapor. At this time, Lieutenant General Anderson, Commander, Mobile Command, visited DRES and was met by the exercise director and Mr. B.J. Perry, Director General, Suffield. The general was accompanied by Brigadier General Edwards and other senior officers. Although the stage was now set to carry out the exercise, approximately 2 weeks were allowed in the field at Suffield to complete the training required by the troops. Particular attention was paid to the correct use of defensive equipment and operational procedures in a chemical environment. After their training was completed, a final test was set up to instill confidence in the troops. An area of ground was specially contaminated, and they were required to occupy and traverse this area. The material used to contaminate the ground was designed to give a positive indication if a soldier were negligent in any way. Special training detector papers were developed for this exercise and were worn by the troops in a normal manner during this test and later throughout the exercise. Several technical trials were carried out during the training phase, one of which was to evaluate the efficiency of the masking drills. The scenario called for a mixed company drawn from the Canadian, British, and U.S. units to occupy and dig in a defensive position. To provide the necessary realism, the troops were challenged by a token enemy force and were brought under simulated small arms fire. The chemical mine simulators were used to duplicate as closely as possible the cloud pattern that would result from an on-target attack by large-caliber, multi-barreled rocket launchers. In addition to fulfilling the main objective, evaluation of the masking drills, the trial provided a most realistic method for training troops to react swiftly in masking drills. Trained personnel observed troop reactions and masking times. As usual, the exercise began in the rain. The average rainfall in this area is 12 inches per year. 3 inches of it fell on the last day of training. The battalion group employed in exercise vacuum was commanded by Lieutenant Colonel H. Pitts, 1st Queen's Own Rifles of Canada. His major problem had been to integrate the 3 companies from Canada, Britain, and the U.S. into an effective single fighting force. There were many supply problems. Each country, for instance, used different clothing and equipment. Particular emphasis was placed on the many chemical operating procedures that had been devised through NATO. At the end of the training period, the exercise director moved his headquarters to the field position chosen for the control of the exercise. This was located in the middle of the Suffield Range, an area of about 1,000 square miles, bounded on the west by the Jenner Road and on the east by the South Saskatchewan River. The range consists largely of rolling hills and coulees, and there is little natural cover. In exercise vacuum, the friendly forces were to advance along a route about 120 miles long, through the heart of this country, to a point across the river. On the first day, the battalion commander was ordered to clear a main supply route for some 40 miles along the main axis and the area immediately east of it, and to secure the junction of routes 7 and 9 by last light. The enemy was expected to conduct a series of small delaying actions and might make a major stand at a coulee across the battalion main axis. The start line was near the Defense Research Establishment at the edge of the range. The friendly forces started moving into their concentration area at 0600 hours, Monday, September 30th, and final checks were carried out in preparation for crossing the start line at 0700 hours. The battalion commander issued his final orders, and the mechanized companies moved forward. At this stage, all troops were wearing their chemical protective clothing in the open state, but not their masks. The friendly troops overcame several delaying obstacles, and by mid-morning were advancing toward a major enemy defensive position at the Big Coulee, as expected. Now the enemy force called in a chemical airstrike. 6 T-33 aircraft carrying a total of 9,000 pounds of liquid agent. The majority of the friendly force vehicles were contaminated in this chemical strike. The attack was observed by the commanding general of the 5th U.S. Mechanized Division, accompanied by the exercise director. Despite the chemical contamination of their vehicles, the friendly forces, being fully protected, were able to capture their objective and continued to advance throughout the rest of the day. The enemy forces responsible for the chemical strikes withdrew to a new position, commanding the road junction, the friendly forces' final objective for that day. Here, they prepared another strong chemical attack. While advancing, the friendly forces found that the rolling terrain of the Suffield Range, having very few readily identifiable features, presents a challenge in navigation. The battalion commander constantly used his helicopter to confirm his forward positions. In spite of the chemical attacks, and most of these troops had never been subjected to chemical attack before, the friendly forces attained their objective at the end of the first day. The advance was now nearing the hilly North Country, with increasing difficulty for both forces. Early in the morning of the second day, the enemy forces used the helicopter-mounted boom sprayer, now fitted with a stabilizing fin, to lay down a chemical barrier. The barrier was encountered by the advance party of the friendly forces, who used their detection procedures to find alternative clean routes. Detour signs were then set up to direct the advance of the main force. For the remainder of the day, there were only isolated chemical attacks against the logistic support elements. One of these, the helicopter-borne M5 dispenser, made a large vapor cloud. Normal logistic resupply of the friendly forces was carried out the second night. The troops were harassed during these critical operations by a chemical attack with the E-8 ripple-fired launchers. And throughout the rest of the night, they sustained heavy chemical attacks from a number of weapon systems. The friendly forces were now north of the original axis and had been taking heavy punishment from the chemical attacks. On the third day, the battalion was ordered to proceed to the forces' reserve area for rest and replenishment. In preparation for the third day's advance, the troops changed into fresh protective clothing, since they had been heavily contaminated during the previous night. The enemy, meanwhile, had called a second major airstrike using 6 T-33 aircraft. They attacked the main body of the friendly forces just after they had cleaned up. This attack was very successful in contaminating the bulk of the deployed friendly forces and required decontamination and cleaning procedures to be carried out again before they could commence their advance. The enemy chemical ground forces took advantage of this period to coordinate the third day's activities. Their first sortie was an off-target attack on the advancing force with chemical vapor clouds dispensed by the Jeep exhaust system. The attacks were the rat patrol type: dart in, quick emission, and retreat. The M4 and M5 powder dispersers were also employed in a similar role. Trouble was encountered, however, with the firing mechanisms in one of the M4 emissions. Not to be outdone and being fully protected, the operator pressed on with the attack using a technique of his own, with surprising success. The effectiveness of these vapor attacks was closely observed by the enemy scouting forces. The ground attacks were supplemented by an aerial strike using liquid training agents. It is noteworthy that due to the hilly nature of the terrain, the enemy achieved surprise in nearly every airstrike. The friendly forces spent the third night in their force reserve position and stayed there part of the fourth day. During that time, they were subjected to 2 more chemical air attacks. At 1200 hours, they were ordered to move out towards their final objective, the hill on the east bank of the South Saskatchewan River. Trouble might be expected at the river crossing. Meanwhile, the enemy forces had moved ahead and were taking up a new defensive position across the river. They laid down concealed batteries of chemical airburst simulators and contaminated large tracts on both sides of the river. By the afternoon, the friendly forces had advanced with 300 vehicles and were assembling their forces for the river crossing. Because of the speed of the river and safety features which had to be observed, this attack was carried out during daylight hours rather than at night. The far bank was secured by the forward advance troops using inflated boats. Then the APCs were swum across to mount the final attack. The light communication vehicles were helicopter lifted across to provide the necessary support. The final attack was on foot. During this time, the troops suffered vapor and liquid attack delivered by the chemical airburst simulators. They achieved their final objective late that day. On the fifth morning, the friendly forces repelled an enemy ground attack and survived a final chemical airstrike. At 1000 hours, the exercise director called a stand down. In exercise vacuum, all the objectives relating to defensive operations in a chemical environment were generally achieved. A wealth of detail was obtained, the evaluation of which will appear in the final report. Many valuable lessons have been learned, and the results will indicate the direction of what further work is required. This exercise is a prime example of what can be achieved in training by the integrated cooperation of the Canadian Forces personnel with defense research scientists.